Welcome to Innovation in Government. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Henry Sowell, the Chief Information Officer at Cloudera Government Solutions. Henry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
Before we get started, let me set a bit of context for our discussion today. We've heard many times data is the new oil, or it's all about the data. But what happens when there's too much data or when your data is dirty or unstructured? Well, these are just some of the challenges agencies are facing every day. And these challenges will only increase as agencies collect more and more data. For instance, data.gov has more than 235,000 data sets, and more than 150,000 of them are of the geospatial kind. At the same time, agencies are realizing the value of data more and more, and are using predictive analytics and other tools that include artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities. The Trump administration recognized agencies need help managing all this data, and that's why the Office of Management and Budget released the Federal Data Strategy last year. In December, OMB detailed an action plan that includes 20 agency actions, including things like the launch of the government-wide Chief Data Officers Council and an assessment of the workforce's data literacy and data skills. Underlying all this data, of course, is security. How can agencies ensure, and this is just another one of those terms we've heard a lot about over the last 15 years, how can they ensure secure information sharing? This concept becomes even more important during the coronavirus pandemic. So how can agencies continue to move forward with this concept of secure information sharing while also taking advantage of many of these emerging technologies and tools? Well, that's where my guest comes in. Once again, my guest is Henry Sowell, the Chief Information Officer at Cloudera Government Solutions. Henry, let's start with some basics. A lot of data, we know that. Let's talk about data governance. What are you seeing from agencies, and what are some of the biggest challenges around data governance?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of interesting things that have happened, especially when you look at a drastic increase in data production. And there's an interest to move and process this data effectively. And one of the things that we see organizations that are investing in streaming processing technologies and other data processing, where they're struggling is data governance as a large challenge that they're having to handle. In many government environments, they have different data producers, such as a data warehouse or machine learning tools or edge devices. And many times that each of these different systems, they have their own proprietary data catalog and policies that secure their data and control access. And it's further exacerbated when you have to connect two or more of those systems. And that's often a critical use case, right? You have the generation of data, you have the processing of data, you have these different pieces. And then each time that you transition between these different systems, you have to reset your schema, security, and access policies so that they remain compliant across a government organization. That's a major challenge. And it introduces risk and consumes a lot of resources to comply with an organization's overall policies. And I think, you add different layers to it, especially when there's a large drive towards the cloud across the government. And when you look at some of the responses of those that have gone to the cloud, also considering that they have to still have some on-premise location. So now you're managing not between just different systems, but you're also managing between those different systems, one on-prem and one in the cloud. And being able to have a consistent security layer is difficult and quite challenging. And I think that's some of the most pressing things that organizations are having to deal with from a governance perspective.
Let's unpack that a little bit. We're seeing a lot around the data strategy. We're seeing steps. Each of the military departments are coming up with a data governance action plan because they're realizing all the value of it, but it's not necessarily going all in the same direction. Maybe it's even a little messy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the lessons learned over the past is that considering your data governance strategy after you've implemented a system is extremely expensive and resource intensive. And they've seen this challenge where at some points they have to actually start over from the ground level. So ensuring that you have a proper data strategy, data governance strategy, is absolutely fundamental. And you know, given the lessons learned over the last couple decades, we're happy to see that many organizations are understanding the importance on that front.
You mentioned this idea of proper data strategy, proper governance. Obviously, every agency is a different part of the continuum. None are starting from zero, none are at 100. We've heard that many times. What are agencies doing, or what can they do, or what are you seeing maybe from your customers about how to address this data strategy governance challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think continuum is the exact right word, right? We have some agencies that have been doing this for quite some time, have extensive policies in place for their data governance strategy, and are developing technology solutions around those strategies, and are extremely firm on their process and their path forward. And then we have other agencies that are still in the policy phase, right? They still have disjointed applications for how effectively they're taking it on. The one thing I am seeing is an increased knowledge sharing across agencies as they're starting to go towards their data strategy and what they've done from a governance perspective. So we're seeing different implementations. The fact is that I think across all agencies, this is starting to become extremely important and foundational as they are developing solutions within their organizations.
And part of that challenge is the fact is there's this increased use of things like video teleconferencing, which we're doing today, or the increase of streaming, like other tools that are requiring more data, more Internet of Things devices. Is that why you think that this governance, the strategy, is more foundational today than maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it is more widely understood that data is at the one of the most important assets within their organization. And when you look at the various technologies, like you said, IoT, there are more edge devices. They have more networks that they're connecting to. They're geographically dispersed. You have all of these different factors that is actually greatly increasing the amount of data that organizations are have to process. So some of those things are driving the priorities, right? Understanding that data-driven decisions are hugely important and beneficial to their mission, and they have this vast amount of data. I think you have more organizations that are understanding the cost of not doing it well.
One of the things that stands out to me is not just the value of data that agencies are seeing, but really it's the amount of data. It's the volume, the value, the velocity, the big V's, 3 V's of data. So you've heard this before, I'm sure, and the fact is that there's a lot of regulations that underpin all this data. And I know in Europe, for instance, there's a big push about a year or so ago for GDPR. That hasn't quite come to the US yet, but there's plenty of regulations and policies around data. So walk me through a little bit about what you're seeing from agencies, how worried or how much does the policy side of this discussion, and whether, I'll even go back to things like PII, personal identifiable information, how much of that is driving how agencies are governing and developing strategies around their data?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations, within the government are actively engaging on this specific topic from a policy perspective. A lot of folks are reading the tea leaves and see that it is likely that something like that is going to be implemented here in the United States. Outside of just the potential upcoming policy, things that are forced upon them, they also have, like what you described, a responsibility over the data that they held. And so, as we see cybersecurity threats, as we see other things that our government customers are having to encounter, it has become extremely important that people are prepared, one, to effectively protect their data. As we've seen, over the last 10 years, the significance of what leaks and different attacks can do to an organization, and the impact that it can have to the constituents of the data that they're holding. This has become extremely important. So we're seeing more effective policy engagement and consideration. We're seeing the importance of effective security architectures to both internally protect access to data, to share it effectively. And sharing effectively doesn't mean just giving data out, but it's also who has access to the data, knowing what data you've got, making sure that it's properly tagged, and that everything is implemented correctly. And then on top of that, having a cybersecurity perspective of understanding the data, where it's at, what is the threat posture, and understanding the threat posture beyond just your data center. You now have a significant amount of external devices. Look at the situation right now, where there are many government employees that are working from home, that are accessing from many different networks that are operating remotely. These are huge challenges that government agencies are having to tackle, and it's their privacy stance on how they protect their data and how do they govern that effectively are paramount right now.
You bring this idea of security. There's plenty to talk, but before I get on that path, let me bring up another point you talked about earlier: risk. One of the ideas of connecting multiple systems, you have multiple layers, and you have multiple clouds. You have cloud, you have on-premise. How are agencies creating this governance? And there's a lot of challenges around there, as there were around this hybrid approach to infrastructure more than they were maybe 5 or 10 years ago.
Yep, absolutely. Because as everybody has gone through this growth in the technology space, everybody that is on the from the commercial front that is designing many of these solutions that are being deployed back into the government, they are understanding the importance of governance. So they are developing their own point solutions, right? And you've had the government in different pockets that have also been developing their own solutions. So you have many different disjointed applications of governance. And when you're bringing all these pieces together, how do you effectively, how do you effectively manage schema, policy, and all these things across these different devices? That becomes hugely challenging. It's one of the things that within Cloudera that is paramount for us, is that how do you have a common layer for security and governance, both on-premise, across different solutions, to manage your data effectively, and that's something that hugely challenging. But now we're starting to see innovation in that space to make this more simple, right? So that we can govern data all the way from our edge devices to in the cloud to your on-premise.
All right, you brought up security a couple of times. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to continue our conversation around security. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network.